Hi, my name is Nshalati. Welcome to Also the Book Club. So today we're going to be reviewing one of my all-time favorite series. It is a series by Matt Wesolowski called Six Stories. Six Stories is a psychological thriller and mystery series and has 6 books at the moment. These books are essentially structured like a true crime podcast series. And so every single chapter in the book is like an episode in a podcast series. In each episode, one person is being interviewed by our main character, Scott King. And sure, there are like external, like minor characters who give us like insight into the different environments, into the different diagnoses and stuff like that. The books can all be read as a standalone, meaning that you can pick up any book without having prior knowledge of a previous book. And so the reading order doesn't really matter in this particular series. In my opinion, I recommend you listen to these books because the audiobooks are really, really incredible. There is a full cast of people narrating the whole story. You hear different voices, different characters. It feels very, very immersive. In one of the books, I believe it's the 4th book, there is a full production happening. So for instance, you can hear like the little clinking in the background. You can hear typing if people are in an office space, that sort of thing. So it improves the reading experience and makes for a great listen, in my opinion. Let's talk about the books. So first on our list is Six Stories. Six Stories is the first book in our series, and it is essentially about Tom Jeffries, who disappears in 1995 on a camping trip, and his body is only found in 1996. Scott King interviews all the parents on the trip, as well as the teenagers who were also on the trip. The teenagers are supposedly his friends, but as we go through the book, we realize that there was quite a lot of animosity and a lot of tension between the group of teenagers. So we follow the story, trying to find out what actually happened in 1995 that led to Tom Jeffries' disappearance. A very interesting thing for me in that particular book was the fact that I read this book 4th, I believe. It was either the 4th book I read in the series or the 3rd book. But because I'd read other books in the series, I felt like something felt really, really weird. So as I'm reading the book, I was like, something doesn't feel the same as all the other stories. Sure, the investigation was run in the same way, but just something felt off, right? Which is something you realize once you get to chapter 5, because everything is glaring at you that there's so many contradictions that shouldn't be here. But once they are revealed in chapter 6, you're like, I knew it! I'm joking, but like that's how I felt the entire time. So this was a really, really great book. It's a great starting book if you start here, but it's also a book that you can pick up at any point in the series and you'll have a great time. Okay, so let's talk about the second book. So the second book is called Hydra, and Hydra does something that the first book doesn't do. So if you read these books in order, you will realize that in book 1, we focus on the whodunit of the mystery. So we're trying to figure out who actually killed Tom Jeffries, if anyone. And in this particular book, we try to find out why the crime was committed, right? Because from the first chapter, aka the first episode of the podcast, we find out that Arla McLeod was the one who brutally murdered her family in her early 20s. But why she did it is the big mystery of this story. The reason why this is very, very compelling is because you realize off the bat that the reason is important is Arla is suffering from psychosis. And with her psychosis, she's unable to be the most objective person about what she did because she also doesn't really, really know. Her perception of reality is warped. It's very, very fractured. And having a conversation with Arla, you could hear in the first episode, was very disjointed. There are things that she says that you're like, girl, what's happening? I remember sitting there going, what imaginary kids are you talking about? She kept referring to these black-eyed kids, and you're like, what? Then you realize she's suffering from psychosis, so obviously she doesn't really have a good grasp on what is happening. But as we follow the story, you realize why she is the way she is. So the way mental illness is discussed in this particular book is fascinating, because it doesn't just delve into the trauma of it all. It also delves into the lead up to this particular trauma, which was very fascinating for me. Another interesting thing about this book was the fact that we got to see a lot more of Scott King, because there's an element of stalking for Scott. Somebody is stalking Scott King, our main character, who's the interviewer, the podcaster. And what's crazy about that is that why would somebody be stalking Scott? Why is someone trying to stop Scott King from investigating this crime? We already know Arla did this, but what is there that these people who are stalking Scott trying to hide, right? So it's a very interesting narrative in that aspect, because it's eerie, it's scary, but at the same time, you just want to know, how did we get here? And that's why a why done it is so much more fascinating in this particular series, especially coming from a who done it. So the third story on our list is called Changeling. Changeling is the story of little Alfie Marsden, who disappeared from his father's car. His father had to stop on the side of the road because something was wrong with the engine, and so he got out. When he came back to the car, his son had disappeared. No one really knows what happened to Alfie Marsden, and years later, we're trying to figure out, if we can, what happened to Alfie Marsden. The story was very interesting because it leads heavily on the supernatural and manipulation. And one wouldn't understand how those two things can intersect until you're reading this particular book. This book helps you learn that not everything that you are told is essentially the truth, right? King goes around interviewing the Marsden's friends and family, just to get an insight of the kind of relationship that the parents had with Alfie, the parents had with one another, the parents had with people around them. And we start to realize that, man, all of these accounts seem very coordinated, seem like they are supposed to fit a specific narrative, right? And as mentioned, it's all about manipulation. Everything you are told may not be true, because some things you are just told and you don't actually see them. The story reminds us to constantly question things that we don't necessarily see, but we are told, right? So I think this is one of my favorite stories, because we also delve more into learning about Scott King, who is our main character. And the reason this was very important to me is that at this particular point, I think this was the fourth or the fifth book I actually read in the series. I realized I didn't know much about Scott King. And once we listen to this particular book, you learn a lot more about Scott King. And I thought hearing more about our main character, who helps us navigate all of these stories, it was quite useful to like build this great picture of the series. And so I think this was my second favorite book. If I haven't mentioned it, this was my second favorite book in the entire series. And I just loved it. The fourth book in the series is called Beast. Beast was a different kind of book, right? So essentially, Beast is about Elizabeth Barton. So Elizabeth Barton is a 24-year-old YouTube vlogger, and she gets locked in the tower and freezes to death. The tower is called a vampire tower because there's a lot of vampire lore in the town that they live in, right? So this story was very interesting, because the reason why the people who got convicted for this crime were convicted, it said it's because they were losers in life and Elizabeth was a winner. So she was more popular, more well-liked, and the people who essentially locked her in the tower where she froze to death were people who believed that she didn't deserve the popularity and the admiration of the people who did admire her on her successful YouTube channel, right? So this book was very, very compelling as well because it looks into, similar to the last book, manipulation of the people, right, around Elizabeth. So as we read the book, we tend to realize that maybe Elizabeth might not have been the most liked person in the whole wide world. She might not even have been like the worst person, but I think the story was very, very interesting because we delve into, similar to the last book, a theme of manipulation. You realize that a lot of people were being manipulated throughout this book, right? So Beast is about people who hoard power, and Elizabeth just seems to be one of those people who hoarded power and wielded that power through her YouTube, her social media, and got people to do things that they would otherwise not do for other regular people. The story is very, very interesting because once you realize what the twist is and you read the book, you realize, oh my gosh, it was all written down there. Another compelling thing about this book, which is slightly different from other books, is that in this book, somebody is actually trying to get the story out there. It seems more like an expose of Lizzie B, which was Elizabeth Barton's name on social media. So it doesn't seem like just Scott discussing a crime story from the past. No, it seems like somebody wants this story out there. And every time Scott tries to interview these particular people, he'd be strayed into asking like specific questions because somebody wanted him in the town to actually do the expose himself, right? So I really, really enjoyed this book, as with all of the books in the series, right? But I think that added an additional element to the story that wasn't there in other stories. So I appreciated this book too. Before I talk about book 5, I need to put down a disclaimer. So this was the first book in the series that I read for the first time, right? So this book was the reason I read the rest of the series. Without this book, I don't think I probably would have had as much excitement for the series as I did because of this book. Right. So I keep saying this is one of my favorite books of all time because this is one of my favorite books of all time. It does something that I think the other books couldn't have done for me to be able to like really, really want to read the series. I probably would have, but I wouldn't have wanted to as much as I did because of this first book. Right. So the first book in the series is called Deity by obviously Matt Wesolowski, and the book looks into the death of Zach Crystal. So Zach Crystal died in his mansion in a fire, and so there isn't a lot of speculation as to why he died. That's not the case here. What makes this book very, very interesting is the fact that this guy is a pop megastar. And if we want to parallel him to somebody in real life, you have to think of Michael Jackson. That is his star power based off of how the book portrays him. There are quite a lot of similarities to Michael Jackson. So that's why I'm quite comfortable saying I think this book might have been inspired by a Michael Jackson type of superstardom. Another thing that was very, very compelling about this book was all the people's perceptions of Zach Crystal. Because Zach Crystal was a pop megastar, he became an enigma. He became somebody that was very, very mysterious to the public, to his fans, to even his family, that the way people talk about him isn't always the same, right? So in the first episode, I remember we talked to a guy who staunchly hates Zach Crystal because he really believes in the allegations. Now, the reason why this book is very, very interesting, quote unquote, or is a reason for someone like Scott King to want to investigate it, is because just before Zach Crystal died, there were allegations surrounding the guy. There were allegations that he may have essayed some teenagers that he would invite to his forest mansion, and there might have been a murder that he should have been charged with. But officially, he wasn't charged with any of that. And hence why there is some suspicion surrounding when he died, how he died, and all of that stuff. So as we're going through the story, we interview somebody who really believes he's a bad guy. We interview somebody who's a mega fan, who wants to hear nothing that that's bad about Zach Crystal. We interview somebody who worked for him. We interview a mom who hates the guy because her teenager was one of his quote unquote special girls. We also interview like somebody who used to work for him intimately but without the public knowing. And we also interview his sister, which was the best chapter in the entire book. And why I like this book was because it helps you question your allegiance, essentially, to celebrities. It helps you question your parasocial relationships with these celebrities online. It helps you question whether or not are we going too far with the way we idolize mere human beings. Because as we go through this book, we start to realize that the facade is cracking. The godlike figure that people have been idolizing for years merely because they make really, really great music, right, might not actually be as great as we wanted them to be. They are not the epitome of society. No. They start to feel like real mortal human beings. And as we know, human beings are very, very flawed. So this book helps you question those particular things, those particular themes. And as a person who read it out of order, you enjoy it for that fact alone. But as a person who also read it in order, you realize something very, very compelling. In the fourth book, we follow Elizabeth Barton's story. Elizabeth Barton's story is about a young 24-year-old who is garnering all of this power from the comfort of her YouTube channel, right? And her aspirations was to be powerful in the media space, right? We now see in book 5 a sequel to what could have been. We see Elizabeth Barton trying to garner that power, and Zach Crystal has it. You realize that, oh my goodness, is this the animal, the monster, the beast that Elizabeth Barton was going to end up as? Man, the series is so good. I don't know how else to express how good the series is. But I think it was one of my favorite series, simply because the loose threads that it does throughout the series are necessary for you to enjoy individual books. However, once you put them all together, you're like, this is a great body of work, right? And man, this book was so good. But yeah, that's what I wanted to say. That's amazing, man. So the 6th book in our series is called Demon, and Demon centers around the case of 12-year-old Sydney Parsons, who was unalived by 2 boys who were his own age. This book was very, very interesting because it leans quite heavily on the supernatural, because the adults at the time in 1995 were unable to wrap their heads around why 2 12-year-old boys could do this to another boy, right? So they have to lean into, were they evil? Were they possessed? There's quite a few superstitions that are being tackled throughout the book. So it's those kinds of things. This book is a really, really great final book, in my opinion. Sure, as I keep saying, you don't really need to read these things in order, but this was a really, really great book if you read them in order, because they do something that they don't do in the other books. They question the morality of Scott King dinging up all these cases. This case happened 26 years ago, and now he wants to investigate it. So people are questioning why the need to do this. People still remember this crime. It is still a fresh wound for the parents of Sydney Parsons. So why would you do this? The reason I think they do this in the book is because it is quite important to put a bit of backlash on the podcast so that Scott feels like, you know what, this is taking too much a toll on me emotionally, so I need to take a break. And if Scott King takes a break, that automatically means the series takes a break. So this was skillfully done. You miss it on the first read, but once you read it the second time, you realize why they make it seem like such a big thing that he's investigating this particular crime in this particular time, because he does that in every single book. He investigates crime where there are still witnesses to these crimes and there are still victims to the crime. So why would that be such a big thing when it hasn't been a big thing until this particular point. And my only observation is because they needed a reason for him to stop the series. And because these kinds of books are written as standalone, you can't just be like, I'm never going to come back. Why? If I'm reading this as the first book, I'm thinking, oh, there's no other books. You know what I mean? So that was a very, very compelling story arc that they followed. And another thing that I enjoyed about this book was the fact that you had so many different characters that chipped into the story, right? So one thing I don't really touch on in the other books is the fact that in as much as there are 6 episodes in the podcast series, there are also minor characters who feed in information into the broader story. So, for instance, we might meet a doctor who gives us information about Allah's psychosis. We're not really going to get Allah's doctor because that would be breaking HIPAA. But we do need that little information where somebody who is a professional gives us some insight into something like psychosis. So in this book, there's quite a lot of people chipping in, but I think that was to help put a lot of pressure on the story by Scott King to essentially, quote unquote, take a break so that this book and this series essentially takes a break and stops. So I really, really enjoyed this book. It was a great final book. Wasn't my favorite, my favorite, but it was a good book nonetheless. Okay, so before I go, here are my final remarks. I enjoyed the series. There's nothing wrong with the series, in my opinion. I think if somebody were to nitpick something about the series, it'd be that they don't enjoy this type of genre. I don't know how you can't enjoy this genre. I'm joking. I know we all have preferences, but I enjoyed the series simply because it was a series that was a lot darker than I'm quite used to in terms of like the books that I do read. And it tackles so many different things, especially because each book is a standalone. So you're not forced into remembering things from past books. No. You just read this one and then you finish it and then you can move on to the next one, which is great if you're not a person who likes to dwell on like stories for a very long time. The reason that I enjoy it as a body of work, as an entire series, is simply because there are like thin threads that are woven in between the entire series that only work, right? That only work with this particular type of structure. I enjoyed it. And I honestly think the best way to enjoy these books is through an audiobook, right? I'll drop down the apps that I use for reading and listening to audiobooks and see if you guys want to do that or check them out. You can also just go on Google and search where you can read these books. I think they are a really, really great set of novels. And if you want to try something that's dark, that has a lot of psychological themes, this is the right series for you to be reading. It's not fluffy. It's not romance. It's straight up thriller, mystery, psychology, and that's that. And in my opinion, it's by far a superior series. I don't have any notes on them. I know it's crazy that I have 0 notes, but I was so immersed with the entire experience that I don't think that they could have done anything better. In the comments, let me know the book you would read first if you were to pick up this series. And also, don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you haven't subscribed. And yeah, okay, bye.